When I was in high school in a town in East Tennessee, my English teacher sent a few of my poems to a literary journal called The Small Farm, edited by a professor at the Baptist College about 15 miles away. The editor, a talented writer named Jeff Daniel Marion, wisely declined to publish my teenage poems. But in the process, I learned A, that there were such things as literary journals, B, that rejections are to be expected, that was useful, and C, that journals sometimes devote an entire issue to a single writer, in this case, one Robert Morgan. I had not heard of this man from the other side of the Appalachians, but I thought he must be a very special writer. That was the beginning of my acquaintance with the multifaceted work of Bob Morgan. A dozen or so years later, I was lucky enough to enroll in his workshop in the MFA program at Cornell. As a teacher, he was kind, generous, perceptive, helping us bring our poems closer to what they aspired to be. At the same time, his writings offered their own kind of teaching. For one thing, Bob's work has taught me a lot about the region I grew up in. In his writings about the people and the natural world of the Appalachian Mountains and foothills, I've always admired his respectful, keenly observant stance toward all varieties of the human, combined with a deep love for the land itself. He reminds us that we can all look more closely, more patiently, into the worlds we think we know. A second inspiration, Bob's endless curiosity. Somehow he knows or takes the time to learn about everything from purple asters to plowing, from the lost colony of Roanoke to the life cycle of locusts, and of course in his hands that knowledge is transformed into poetry. A third quality I love is the poem's evocation of sounds, voices at a Christian revival, the sadness in dulcimer music, the rasping anthem of cicadas. In one poem, a cricket strikes black sparks from its flint. In another, crickets ping their chisels. What all this comes down to, I think, is that Robert Morgan keeps enticing me to try to make poems. His poetry shows me that there's so much in the world I'm not noticing, that all that richness is waiting to be evoked if I can only look closer, listen harder, hone the language. Bob, I'm thrilled to be here, to use a word we talked about a lot this morning. Thanks for your poems and all your kindness. I'm going to read now from a book I published last year called Passing Worlds, Tahiti in the Era of Captain Cook. It tells in an elliptical way the story of the earliest encounters of Tahitians with Europeans and the unforeseen consequences that unfolded. It focuses mainly on the visit of the Endeavour under Captain James Cook exactly 250 years ago. I'll read 3 poems. The first one is about the boyhood of Joseph Banks, the aristocratic botanist on the voyage. The first stanza quotes from a letter that his tutor sent to Banks's father to report on his progress. Joseph Banks, botanist and patron. 14 and lordly, a great inattention in him, rich boy at Eton, and an immoderate love of play. But one warm evening alone in the gold light of a lane, richly enameled with flowers, for the first time he saw what flowers are. Under the shimmer of color whose beauty drew him, near infinite variety, a leaf like moist silk, another leather, saw-toothed, ribbed, blossoms trumpet, hood, soft spokes, diverse delicate turns of a petal's fluting, dance of stamen, pistil, pollen, bee. He would learn botany, learn the whole natural world. Rich boy, but only one book, his mother's tattered Gerard's Herbal, and no teacher. eaten imparting not the thinnest slice of science. And so, what else became visible? Women. Poor country women, gypsies, gatherers of simples, who searched out, dug, picked, and sold to apothecaries their stock in trade. Their wrinkles and rough hands, rural accent, rude grammar, no word of Latin, no letter of Greek, no lady's learning of harpsichord, embroidery, gavotte, minuet. They made their living by leaf and flower, berry and root, by knowing how each in poultice or tea might heal. Rich boy, yes, but a mind that could listen, knew when the foreign, the inferior, could teach him. Paid 6 pence for each bit of knowledge and learned. The Europeans and Tahitians in these very early encounters were often mystified by each other's behavior. This poem is from the viewpoint of the British, and it's full of quotations from their journals, which was one of the fun things about working on this. As the title indicates, they had given Tahiti a British name. Impressions of the natives of King George's Island. Timorous, merry, facetious, hospitable, generous with breadfruit, coconuts, hogs, and errant thieves. Pickpockets quick as London's, snuffbox, spyglass, gone. Let them on board, they filch a bowl, a cleat, a knife, snatch a midshipman's hat from his head, pry the very glass from out the portholes. On land, the astronomer's quadrant from a guarded tent. The captain at rest, but not, he swears, asleep. They stole his stockings from under his head. Women so easy with favors we could scarce believe our luck at first. Then the price shot up from a 20 or 30 penny nail to a 40 penny, and some so extravagant as to demand a 7 or 9 inch spike. Nails by the sackful vanish from the hold, and none knows a thing about it. Men sleep on deck, having spent their hammock nails. It's said the Dolphin crept off creaking. So many cleats and nails pried out, she threatened to fall apart. An indolent people, a long night's sleep and midday naps, and in that soft climate, the fruit drops into their mouths. And yet, they carve a 60-foot canoe with an adze and chisel made of stone, with human bones for awls, with shark's teeth and shells. They weep to see a sailor flogged, even for crimes against themselves, and beg the captain to let him go. And yet, in human custom, among a certain lordly class, enjoying free liberty in love, untroubled by consequence, every infant smothered at the moment of birth. At times, to please their gods, they knock a low-born fellow on the head, truss the corpse to a pole, and offer it in grisly ritual. Their enemies' jawbones gleam in the temple shadows. The children are remarkably kind to one another. And one last poem about a girl caught up in the sex trade that was such a crucial part of these early encounters. Not recorded, girl. She was 16 or 12 or 10, and she bathed in the river 3 times a day. Possibly virgin, probably smoothed her hair with coconut oil, her legs and buttocks likely dark with elaborate tattoos. And was she curious when chosen, ordered, to lie with a stranger, old or young but surely stinking, rippled with muscle from a life at sea, or weak with ulcered skin and rotten teeth? Surprised that a face like bark had a body root white, hair on the chest? Attracted? A man frantic for sex, man from an unimaginable, did she imagine, land? And what was it like to feel his breath, his hands, his penis, and when he was done, go home, relieved, proud, sullied, weeping, with a nail, tool of rare, unbreakable iron, sharp to speed the work of men. Picture her handing it over. She walks alone to the river, waving off the greedy flies, and steps in up to her neck. She lays the back of her head on the water and stares so deep in the sea of the sky, her body grows lighter, her feet lift from the sand. Imagine her as the water glides around her and on, imagining herself gazing down on the island world, on Mount Orahena where rivers are born, down on the casuarinas and palms where parrots flash and hide their colors, down on the river that parts for a girl bathing. Thanks.
I came to Cornell in 1977 to study with Robert Morgan because I had already read, dog-eared, obsessed over, and tried to imitate his poems. Those poems were my first master class in how to pay exquisitely close attention to the everyday world with the precision instrument of language. I'm deeply grateful for all I learned from Bob and his work back then, and for all I am still learning. And it's a true joy and honor to read with you, Bob, today. Okay. I'm going to read one poem in 12 short sections. It's a poem written while I was living in Amsterdam a few years ago. When I first arrived, I was reading Ecclesiastes, that beautiful lament in the Hebrew Bible about the transience of all things. The speaker looks at his life and bemoans that everything is vanity, vanity. Or in a closer translation of the Hebrew, everything is breath, breath. It was my routine in Amsterdam to go online every morning to get the day's weather forecast. Because I don't read much Dutch, I would always Google Translate the forecast. I don't know if it's because Dutch is a delightfully idiomatic language, or because Google Translate was just having a good time with me. But the translations that popped up were wildly whimsical, even philosophical narratives. And soon Ecclesiastes and the Google mistranslations were talking to each other in my head. Eventually, those two voices made their way into this poem, and I hope you'll be able to distinguish their voices as I read. Before I read, though, there are a few things to know. Oude Kerk is the oldest church in Amsterdam, and it's right in the middle of the red light district. There is a lot of Flemish and Dutch art in this poem, including one section about a particularly vivid Last Judgment altarpiece. In another section, I overhear a tourist talking about an altarpiece with scenes from the life of Jesus. One of those scenes is actually the flight to Egypt, when Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt with their baby to avoid the terror Herod was inflicting on the Hebrews. At one point in the poem, there's a pair of parentheses, and because you cannot see them, I will go like this. They're important. And you'll hear the name Clara Peters. She was one of a handful of wonderfully accomplished 17th century Dutch women painters whose work survives. The title of the poem is Duet for Ecclesiastes and Dutch Weather. 1. The wind blows to the south and goes round to the north. Round and round goes the wind, saith the preacher. But everybody's talking this winter about the weather. Prophets, wise guys, whiners, winners. Back home, they've named new species of storm and concocted snowy synonyms for apocalypse. while the warmest winter in an eon is happening here, in a language I can't catch and that Google garbles. This morning, one time shining in the east, even the sun. In the west, the clouds, and by noon, the light may rain. 2. Home is where the windswept heart was. Here it hopes to live within its means. No debts or debtors, no trespassing either way, and the squares on the tacked-up calendar pristine as Dutch windows. But what if the eye is still not satisfied with seeing, or the ear filled with hearing, and what has been is what will be? Each morning, when I hoist the heavy drapes, the high, clear pane reframes the question in cobalt and a rush of North Sea cloud. 3. Everything else in this city knows what to do. The trams clanging in perfect pitch, the canals and their civilized water, the bijou bridges, the flock and veer of bikes, precise as swallows. Even the hothouse blooms in buckets, hue by hue on the street corner. Even the lager in the cafe glass, and the herring on thick ice at the fish stand. Even the rumble of winter thunder. Even the hail throwing its hissy fit. 4. Last night draw the rains from Belgium. In the course of the night, they left the country, though there is a new mood emerged along the west coast, from which a shrike flies in with the wind to my skinny yard, skewers a mole in the fence-top flower box, and plucks its muscles out among the crocus. My neighbor can see this too from her identical window, if she's watching. Who is my neighbor? That woman who urged us, as she kept the taxi waiting, to employ all 4 of our front door locks. 5. The poor will always be among us, even in the rich museum. Their light singles out and saves a man with the battered gleam of a pewter cup, and soothes a ragged child with a tad of ochre and the crusty lightness of bread. If others still hunger and thirst in this humane city, it's impossible to see them, though I have seen the naked, shades darker than the Dutch, and in glass stalls in the backside shadow of the oldest church. 6. This, I heard a tourist tell her husband, stopped before the triptych, is the Annunciation, and this the Nativity, and this the rest on the flight to Europe. And this is what I've come for, the gilt gone, and Flemish windows flung open to let in the light. Behind each holy foreground, another tiny tour de force of reeds, swans, gleaners, horsemen, spires. Then an exhalation of white. Then indigo, striding more and more boldly away from every earthly thing that painter knew. 7. Next week have depressions eat mainly Scandinavia, while a high-pressure nuclear southwest of Ireland tries to keep the weather in our area. But if I'm reading right, between the isobar lines, it's just to everything there is a season, etc. Lows to the north, highs to the west, and in the middle of the night sometimes, a moon so merciful, it ransoms with silver every ripple, lock, and edge. And sometimes a mood so black, there is nothing in heaven for a street light to blot out. 8. Big books on a small shelf, light from a wide window and no phone, no promises to keep. Then a flyer's pushed through the mail slot. Africa meets Amsterdam, hijab meets hip-hop. Since you're our neighbors, we thought we'd invite you. Who else are my neighbors? Some I recognize from paintings. The cheeky maid at the checkout, the tavern drunk turned frizzled pothead, the lovesick girl on the tram, frowning down its secrets, scent in air, and hidden in her cagey hand. 9. Spring weather remains steadfast. A weak depression in the immediate vicinity of the Netherlands grabs his stuff, and the temperature takes a walk. As do I, dodging locals sunning on every stretch of canal-side brick that could conceivably be cafe. But this ain't Paris, it's big beer all round. No one frets. The lavish heat might mean Antarctica is shrugging off its cold shoulder. They flirted here with luxury and sea level for centuries and got the dams, dikes, and Calvinism to prove it. 10. You can't count on good weather even at the judgment. All that light in the east stirs up thick thunderheads, and not just beneath the Lord's left hand above the horny hags of hell. Even the saved hurry out of graves to beat the downpour. But my favorite angel's in no rush. He escorts his handsome catch into a heavenly line, his hand firm on the other's naked ass. Innocent? Hard to tell from his perfect face. Though he does gaze back above the routed and raptured and over a feathery shoulder to a past in which I seem to stand. 11. Possible that there's a temporary gray morning. The weather is tentative, characterized by lots of cloud and rain. Rain. And I know how that feels. The drab revisor in the brain fussing vanity, vanity, vanity of vanities. Then I think of Clara Peters. Among her lush epitomes of lemon and slick fish, she carved her name with paint onto a knife blade, and on a quiet inch of the golden age's finest pewter lid, she caught her cloud-lit face. 12. There is nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their toil. Light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. Today we have to wait for the sun. Tomorrow the sun shines a lot, but still mostly cloudy, watery veil hurt by some fields in the morning. The rest of the week taps the back of a very different tune, making it ideal weather to tackle on a terrace. Or to douse the drapes, lug my duffel to the Luchthaven, and head back home against the jet stream, 30,000 feet above the blue oblivion and every possible April. Thank you for listening.
In 1974, when I arrived at Cornell to begin the MFA program, I was 23 and Bob was 30. And his first book, Red Owl, had been published two years earlier. And now, all those books. Bob and Nancy befriended me, a virtually moneyless kid from a little college in Iowa. Bob hired me to cut their grass once a week, whether it was needed or not, and paid me $20 a pop, which in 1974 felt like something. More than that, of course, Bob gave me the great gift of taking me seriously as a writer, as he did for all of us, reading our work with generous attention, critically, of course, but always with encouragement. What he did for us was the most important thing a mentor can do for a young writer. He countenanced us. Thank you, Bob. In those years, I lived on University Avenue in an apartment facing that long slate wall overhung with forsythia that became spangled with yellow blossoms in spring. So here's a sonnet from those beginning days, titled somewhat excessively, "On Forsythia Overhanging a Slate Wall, University Avenue, Ithaca, New York." Forsythia sprawls from a central bang. Branches arc like delight, as if to map trajectories of the heart. When the sap knocks in its pipes, the yellow blossoms swing like suns, brief trumpets loud with their light, squeezed out from a branch of the void. Suns cool, then drop like blossoms or cities into the pool that can't be ruffled and reflects no light. This bush shows how, by resistance, lives are built. Forsythia, slow fountain, drills for the heart, taps capillary rills and pumps rich silt, finds rhymes in the leaves' green labs, knots dirt and sunlight tight, and over this slate wall slows water to a lobed and tendrilled fall. 2019, of course, is a big year for Whitman, his 200th anniversary of his birth, May 31st, 1819. And I've been thinking a lot about Whitman over the last 10 years when I've been involved in a collaboration with an artist who develops photographs in the flesh of leaves. We did a book called War Memoranda, collaboratively, poetry, art, and so forth. But to mark Whitman's birthday, I want to read the butterfly portrait. Maybe you've seen it. He's looking at a butterfly perched on his finger. The butterfly portrait. In the portrait, his favorite, Whitman in slouch hat, cardigan, beard, regards a butterfly perched on his finger. Spring 77 in Curtis Taylor's lens. Yes, it was real, he told a friend. I've always had a knack of attracting critters. It was not. The cardboard prop was fastened in place with wire. Later, the poet, chair-bound in Camden, let his papers fall like leaves around him. As Archie said, autumn trees stand in pools of themselves. Whitman, in his rocker, left piles unstacked in natural disorder and told a visitor, what I need comes to hand. But he kept his paper butterfly near, packed in a box, chrysalis or coffin, for others to find. I laid in my stores in advance. I considered long and seriously of you before you were born. Photographer's prop and poet's trope. It's a little book, 2 leaves, 4 pages, painted on the bottom and printed on top with an Easter verse. The first begotten of the dead, for us he rose, our glorious head. The poet nothing affirmeth, and therefore never lieth. But he lied and affirmed. The critter was paper, and paper lives. Who touches this touches a man. And the eastern tiger swallowtail that nectars a lily, yellow and black, in my garden this morning, emerged and clung to its cracked tomb just days ago, pumping its wings, readying for flight, its colors stiffening. I've written a few sonnets, and this one comes out of our contemporary times, but is about an old painting. Jan Bruegel the Elder's A Woodland Road with Travelers. Midway in their desperate journey, they find themselves in a dark wood. Women in skirts and domed hats carry heavy jugs and stuffed baskets, all they now own. Men drive beasts, pigs on leashes, horses tethered to a wagon tipping, too full of nothing, terribly valuable. At least today the weather clears at last. One woman quietly sings. About suffering, we are always wrong these days. In Bruegel's painting, we peer from the woods. The travelers' backs, strong but bent, are what we see as they steer themselves toward a distant city. I am in that city and watch them coming. Their faces don't scare me. Well, these days, we sometimes resort to the consolations of literature and friendship. And this poem is about those things, and I'd like to address it on this occasion specifically to Robert Morgan. It's called In a Field of Weeds, and it carries an epigraph by Pascal. Man is but a reed, the weakest in nature, but he is a thinking reed. A proposition in doubt currently. 5 degrees, rough shifting winds, sunlight crashing almost audibly, sky to snowpack, snowpack to sky. Eyes shrink hard to their smallest stop, but winter drills in. Brilliant splinters of ice in the air blow up and down. In the polished field, stiff weeds poke through like rusty wire. Stems and branches, anchored in ice, shake hard with gusts, knock stalk on stalk, and litter the snow with broken reeds. Detritus lifts in a whirl of air, then lies back down. Hollow weeds rattle bone on bone, and the man who listens slowly turns to scan the rim of an icy zero. Acres of snow reach every way. Sunlight fills the blinding page. He has come out here to read what it says, and he thinks he knows. He walks back home and remembers everything. Everything holds in his icy mirror. When words arrive, he chooses those which fabricate nothing, take nothing away. I read the words on the snowy page, and they stick like burrs. They name the terror and make it flower. We stand together. One last little short one. Again from Ithaca Days, and this first little book, so beautifully done in letterpress by Tim Larkin back in those days. It's a little 9-line poem about the green world, and I mentioned lettuce in it, and a request, when you picture lettuce, it would help this poem tremendously if you pictured romaine lettuce. I think it works better than bib or iceberg or some of these others. Just a cue. Fire eater. On the sun, the fiery towers hurtle up. Bright arcs billow and split, blown by genial rage. The earth answers mildly. Its green corona shines on the hills. And who is happier than I am, browsing the lettuces, tasting the cooled, brittle flames? Thank you.
It's a great honor to be here and to read with Bob and Lynn and Liz and to hear all those wonderful presentations this morning. It's a heady experience, I'll tell you. And after an introduction like that, I mean, what can you do to justify such an introduction? I thought what I would do today is read a couple of short excerpts from this biography of Edgar Allan Poe, addressing the issue of why he is so popular, since so much of his work is so dark. And the second is about Walt Whitman's attitude toward Edgar Allan Poe, which evolved in a very interesting way. They actually knew each other back in New York in the 1840s, and it is the 200th anniversary of Walt Whitman's birth. In 1829, Poe had written in the album of Miss Lucy Holmes of Baltimore a poem called Alone, oddly never included in any of his 4 books of poetry published in his lifetime. Yet this is one of his most powerful early poems, and one of the most revealing. Though he likely had written the poem earlier and memorized it before jotting it down in the young lady's album, one can imagine that Poe composed it extempore to flatter Judge Holmes's daughter, and then forgot about it. Years later, he would dash off another poem with just such virtuosity and panache. Like Li Po, the Chinese poet, he could compose poems and watch them float away on a river. No doubt we should hear the poem spoken by a Byronic figure of his imagination with a Virginia accent. But it's hard not to believe that Poe revealed a good bit about himself in this fugitive confession called Alone. From childhood's hour, I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source, I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my heart to joy at the same tone. And all I loved alone. Then, in my childhood, in the dawn of a most stormy life, was drawn from every depth of good and ill the mystery which binds me still, from the torrent, from the fountain, from the red cliff of the mountain, from the sun that round me rolled in its autumn tint of gold, from the lightning in the sky as it passed me flying by, from the thunder and the storm and the cloud that took the form when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon, in my view. Imagine writing that and then forgetting it, never reprinting it. One of the ironies of American literary history is that the supposedly democratic poet Walt Whitman, who dreamed of writing of and for the masses, found mostly a learned urban audience in his lifetime. While Poe, who saw himself as an elite genius, superior to the mob, became one of the most widely read and popular poets of his century. This poem alone may be a clue to Poe's popularity. For paradoxically, Poe, in his sense of alienation and difference, speaks for each of us. For most experience just such a sense of isolation. In our hearts and deepest selves, we feel alone, and in some ways are thrilled by that separation, by the mystique of being exceptional. And unlike other romantics, except perhaps Coleridge and Byron, Poe recognizes the darker side of that individuality. Quote, from every depth of good and ill, the mystery binds me still. The voice in Poe's poem, the persona, concedes the ill as well as the good in the self. This gives a depth and richness to Poe's work that many romantic poems lack. He's a romantic poet, certainly, but in the tradition of rhyme of the ancient mariner, Kubla Khan and Don Juan. Contrary to conventional wisdom, Poe is also a poet of nature, though it is often the nature of storms and lightning flung like arrows, and a demon looking down from the sky rather than an angel. As one of the damned, he speaks as a far more stirring informant than a more predictable and benign narrator would. By announcing that he cannot bring his passion from a common spring, Poe, speaker, actually does just that. The spring we all recognize as the source of our alienation, anxiety, mystery, guilt, and uniqueness. Poe locates the reader in a deeper, more complex sense of identity and humanity. By tapping into the guilt and sense of difference, Poe makes us feel strangely connected to humanity. From his earliest memory, Poe knew he was different and felt he was damned. For the rest of his life, he carried that sense of guilt and doom. It was partly this guilt, this sense of a curse, that Baudelaire and others responded to with such excited recognition. It is one of the purposes of biography to study the sources of such dread, guilt, and confession as Poe exhibited in both his life and his art. On the one hand, Poe aspired all his life to the ethereal, to the realm of angels, angels from mythology, from the Quran, Near Eastern goddesses such as Astarte, more than Christian angels and figures. Yet his writing taps into strong, sadistic tendencies, releasing violent forces in his imagination, and sometimes in his actions when he was drinking. He is the poet of the imp of the perverse, of gratuitous and self-destructive cruelty. His characters torture and kill, are tortured and killed, are buried prematurely. In his reviews, in his cups, Poe could be cutting and harsh. When sober, he was unfailingly courteous, helpful, generous, and gentle. In the noted poem Israfel, the speaker declares the poetry of earth, however difficult to create, has better claims on the wisdom of eternity than the perfectly spiritual and ethereal poetry of heaven. The visions and rhetoric of Emerson, Poe, and Whitman might have shared many features, but in their lifetimes, the kinship was unnoticed. Poe had made too many enemies with his harsh reviews and remarks about the transcendentalists, whom he called the Frogpondians. After Poe's death, Whitman would remember the author of Eureka in print, but his words would show little appreciation at first. Poe was not of the fellowship, and even worse, he was thought of as a Southerner. As far as we know, Whitman never mentioned Eureka, but in his reminiscences and Specimen Days, he does refer to Poe on 2 occasions. Quote, I also remember seeing Edgar A. Poe and having a short interview with him. It must have been in 1845 or 6 in his office, second story of a corner building, Duane or Pearl Street. He was editor and owner or part owner of the Broadway Journal. The visit was about a piece of mine he had published. Poe was very cordial in a quiet way, appeared well in person, dress, etc. I have a distinct and pleasing remembrance of his looks, voice, manner, and matter, very kindly and human, but subdued, perhaps a little jaded. Specimen Days and Collect was published in 1882. On January 1st, 1880, Whitman had penned an entry called Edgar Poe's Significance. It begins, in diagnosing this disease called humanity, I have thought that poets present the most marked indications. That is, poets and poetry are the most accurate index of the health of a time and place. While it is most desirable for people to be noble, morally flawless, healthy in mind and body, it is an undeniable fact that many artists have to attain their heroic achievements, quote, through failures, sorrows, temporary downfalls. As examples, Whitman lists Burns, Byron, Schiller, and George Sand. Quote, "But we do not see it in Edgar Poe. All this is the result of reading at intervals the last 3 days a new volume of his poems. I took it on my rambles down by the pond, and by degrees read it all through there. While to the character first outlined, the service Poe renders is certainly that entire contrast and contradiction which is next best to fully exemplifying it." If I understand Whitman correctly, he's saying that the second best way to see the essential noble and heroic in poetry is to encounter poetry where those virtues are absent. That absence, as in the poetry of Poe, will remind us of the importance of health and nobility. Whitman seems not to acknowledge Eureka, or Poe's final essay, The Poetic Principle. The Poe he remembers is filtered through Rufus Griswold's scurrilous posthumous memoir and the rumors about Poe's irregular life in New York. The kindly Whitman adopts a patronizing tone about the drunken, womanizing, unreliable Poe. Quote, "Almost without the first sign of moral principle, or of the concrete or its heroisms, or the simpler affections of the heart, Poe's verses illustrate an intense faculty for technical and abstract beauty, with the rhyming art to excess, an incorrigible propensity toward nocturnal themes, a demoniac undertone behind every page, and by final judgment probably belong among the electric lights of imaginative literature, brilliant, dazzling, but with no heat." Disparaging as Whitman may sound about Poe's poetry, he touches on two essential themes in this paragraph. His intuition tells him there is a great deal more to the excessively rhymed poems if someone were able to delve and decipher them. The real meaning of the poems may not be on the surface, but buried under the technical effects. Whitman also understood the need for the biographical study of Poe, the study of Poe's ancestors, his background, his childhood and youth, his education, his life in Baltimore and other cities, to truly know his work. It is not the kind of observation Whitman would have made about Emerson, Bryant, Lowell, or Hawthorne. But with Poe, Whitman understood that biography was both fascinating and material. In 1875, a monument to Poe was erected in Baltimore over his grave. Stéphane Mallarmé had written a poem for the occasion, the elusive sonnet Le Tombeau d'Edgar Poe. There was a crowd to honor Poe, but the only major American writer present at the ceremony was Walt Whitman, who never missed an opportunity for publicity. Whitman refused to speak at the ceremony, but he later told reporters, quote, "For a long while, and until recently, I had a distaste for Poe's writing. I wanted and still want for poetry the clear sun shining and fresh air blowing and the strength and power of health, not of delirium, even amid the stormiest passions, but with always the background of the eternal moralities. Non-complying with these requirements, Poe's genius has yet conquered a special recognition for itself, and I too have come to fully admit and appreciate it and him." And then Whitman reveals that he almost certainly remembered an image from either M.S. Found in a Bottle or the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. "In a dream I once had, I saw a vessel in the sea at midnight on a storm. It was no great full-rigged ship, nor a majestic steamer, steering firmly through the gale. It seemed one of those superb little schooner yachts that I had often seen lying anchored, rocking so jauntily in the waters around New York or up Long Island Sound. Not now flying, uncontrolled, with torn sails and broken spars through the wild sleet and wind and waves of the night. On the deck was a slender, slight, beautiful figure, a dim man, apparently enjoying all the terror, the murk, the dislocation of which he was the center and the victim. That figure of my lurid dream might stand for Edgar Poe. His spirit, his fortunes, his poems, themselves all lurid dreams." And then Whitman seems to take Poe as representative of his age, not the alien or the exception. The implication is that Whitman understood that Poe, with all these horrors and chills, was perhaps the more definitive poet of his time. Speaking to Horace Powell, long after Poe's death, Whitman blamed R.H. Stoddard for both cashing in on Poe's fame and maligning his character, and for defending the shameless Rufus Griswold. Whitman calls Stoddard not only weak, but malignant, the moral offense which this New York crowd can never forgive Poe for is that he is famous, is held in great esteem wherever he is known. I've quoted Whitman at length because he is certainly one of the greatest poets of Poe's century, and because he seemed to glimpse the real importance of Poe's work. As Whitman saw it, he himself wrote a poetry of health, while Poe wrote a seductive poetry of sickness, definitive to his time. But Poe's poetry is much more complex than Whitman's. Whitman's poems are explicit, direct, while Poe's poems present a lyrical, mesmeric surface with many strata of symbolic meaning underneath. Poe has a tragic view of human experience, a knowledge of the imp of the perverse in each of us. Poe understood the loneliness and alienation of the human individual, but he also understood the aspiration toward the ethereal, the infinite, the deep human bonds with others, especially women. Protestations of optimism and health do not necessarily reassure us, given our actual experiences and fears in this world and in time. Poe's melancholy establishes a bond with his readers, as do tragic ballads and songs of sorrow. Poe's famous translator, Charles Baudelaire, would write in his poem, Benediction, this is a very rough translation, "I know that sadness is the only nobility on which neither hell nor earth can sink its teeth." I will conclude by reading three poems. Ray's already read Double Springs. That last line, "that ungodly taste I'd carry home," I worked on that for about a year. I just couldn't get the right adjective somehow. And finally, they've come out of the church, this person, so ungodly seemed the right one. This poem, though it's actually a form from Malaysia or Indonesia somewhere, it's interlocking quatrains. The second and fourth lines become the first and third lines of the second quatrain, et cetera, and then the last line is also the first line, so it circles back. And the problem with writing a pantoum is how do you tell a story with all of that repetition? So you have to find something where repetition is good, it suits the subject. And I love the image of Audubon playing his flute when he's out in the wilderness looking for birds. Thoreau was a flute player at Walden. Thomas Cole, the great Hudson River painter, was a flute player. Audubon in the summer woods by the afternoon river sips his flute, his fingers swimming on the silver as silver notes pour by the afternoon river, sips and fills the mosquito note air with silver as silver notes pour 200 miles from any wall, and fills the mosquito note air as deer and herons pause, listen, 200 miles from any wall, and sunset plays the stops of river. As deer and herons pause, listen, the silver pipe sings on his tongue, and sunset plays the stops of river. His breath modeling a melody, the silver pipe sings on his tongue, coloring the trees and canebrakes, his breath modeling a melody over calamus and brush country, coloring the trees and canebrakes to the horizon and beyond over calamus and brush country, where the whitest moon is rising to the horizon and beyond his flute, his fingers swimming on where the whitest moon is rising. Audubon in the summer woods. Several people have mentioned my father, and I have written a good bit of poetry about him. He was somehow larger than life, and a lot of contradictions about him. That means he's a very good subject for poetry. He was very well read, he was very interested in history, he was a great talker. A few years ago, I gave a talk in my hometown to the Western North Carolina Historical Society, and after it was over, the chairman, who knew my father, came up and said, you're a good speaker, you're almost as good as your dad. But my dad liked to work outside in rainy weather, and this poem is called Working in the Rain. My father loved more than anything to work outside in wet weather. Beginning at daylight, he'd go out in dripping brush to mow or pull weeds for hog and chickens. First his shoulders got damp, and the drops from his hat ran down his back. When even his armpits were soaked, he came in to dry out by the fire, make coffee, read a little. But if the rain continued, he'd soon be restless and go out to sharpen tools in the shed or carry wood in from the pile, then open up a puddle to the drain, working by steps back into the downpour. I thought he sought the privacy of rain, the one time no one was likely to be out, and he was left to the intimacy of drops touching every leaf and tree in the woods, and easy muttering of drip and runoff, the shine of pools behind grass dams. He could not resist the long ritual, the companionship and freedom of falling weather, or even the cold drenching, the heavy soak and chill of clothes and sobbing of fingers and sacrifice of shoes that earned a baking by the fire and washed fatigue after the wandering and loneliness in the country of rain. And the last is the title poem from the volume Terroir. It's a French word meaning, I guess, soil, basically, but it's used by critics of food and particularly wine to describe the particular quality of one, the individual. And, of course, that made me think of Hopkins' idea of inscape, right, which is the particular, the moment, this scene, this instance in time. I love to talk to students about the controversy between the Dominicans of Paris who are interested in the quiddity, the categories, and Hopkins interested in the hexiety, following the great Franciscan John Duns Scotus. Terroir, that quality that seems unique as thriving from a special spot of soil, airflow, and light specific, and also frost and winter sleep, conditions of particular year, as every instance comes just once, with mix of mineral and grease, what Hopkins chose to call inscape, or individuation, sounds so close to terror you'd confuse the two, as if the finest and the rarest blend would come with just a hint of fear or pain, the sting and shiver of revulsion with the savor of the earth and sun for this once not returning, sung for this one ear on this one tongue. Thank you.